Part 2 of a story I wrote called The Rag Doll. It was a week before he saw Isabel back in his daughter's room. He'd been watching for her and had seen her from time to time lying in the mud in the neighbor's front yard. On another occasion, he'd watched as the boy down the street had tied her to the fender of his bike and had dragged her along behind him. It was no surprise to him that the doll was returned with black smudges on her face, one foot completely covered in dry, caked-on mud, and the seams on her hands beginning to fray. Once again, the father talked with his daughter about taking better care of her treasure. She seemed to pay attention, then disappeared into her room, once again tossing Isabel onto the nearest piles of clothing. As the days grew colder, the girl played indoors more, sometimes even having her friends come play in her room. The boys just loved to tease her about the doll, and they would toss Isabel back and forth over the young girl's head. There were many days that Isabel was the football, flying high overhead. Sometimes she would hit the ceiling, others she would bang against the wall. The father heard everything that happened in his daughter's room. He could have gone in there and sent all the boys home, but he didn't. He waited for his daughter to take responsibility for what he'd given her. There were times he would call them all into the kitchen for refreshments, and when they all clambered into the chairs around the table, he would place his hand on his daughter's shoulder, and their eyes would meet. She knew what the look meant. She knew she wasn't taking good care of her doll. She knew he was disappointed in her, and that made her mad. So one night, when everyone was gone and her father was sleeping, she took the doll and took all of her anger out on Isabel. She pounded her stomach with her fists, dragged her by the hair across the hardwood floor of her room, and threw her against the wall. And as she slid to the ground, the seams along her side gave way and burst. The father, who had not really been asleep, had come to check on his daughter. Hearing the noise, he stopped just short of the door. He could hear her yelling at the doll, "I hate you! I hate you! I hate you!" And yet, there were more to her words than just that. The father could tell from the tone of her voice. He waited a long time, just standing there, not wanting to intrude, until it was all quiet and peaceful. He slowly opened the door, and he found his daughter lying on the bed, traces of tears still on her face, but her breathing told him she was sound asleep. All around the room were the clothes that Isabel had once worn. The box that had once held her possessions was smashed into 1,000 splintered pieces. He could not see Isabel anymore. She wasn't on her shelf, not crumpled in the corner where he'd seen her many nights. She wasn't even under the bed, which was the most recent place he'd found her. As his eyes scanned the darkness, he saw traces of her stuffing along the floor that led to the closet. Then he saw a hand. It was sticking out from under the closet door. The father looked in the closet, and there was Isabel. She needed so much care if she was ever going to look like the doll she was created to be. The stitching in her heart had come undone, and now inside of her heart was a giant hole. Her hair was matted. Her once nice cloth body was soiled and filthy. Her eyes had lost their sparkle, and even her smile had seemed to be faded beyond recognition. The father stood there for a long time, yearning to take Isabel back from his daughter. He stood motionless, wanting to put her back in her clothes, back on her shelf, back even to the one who had made her. But he wouldn't. He'd given his word that this was his daughter's. He would not take her away, even though it broke his heart to see what had become of her. He knew the world would think she had lost her value, but he would always remember what she was created for and what she was really like. He would always see her as she had been the day she arrived. As he remembered that day, and once again looked at her now, a single tear slid down his eye. In the morning, he would speak with his daughter again. Many years went by before the daughter would listen to her father. When she did speak to him, it was to ask him for a new doll. She'd grown since she had had that little girl, and since she'd been that little girl, and now she wanted to show him she could be responsible. She promised him that she would take better care of the next one, and she begged and pleaded for a new doll. He softly spoke his reply, "No, you have one already." "I don't want her. It's just a rag doll," was his daughter's quick response. "She is old, ugly, scarred, and ruined." Her father once again softly reminded her, "She is what you made her to be." But she would not listen to her father. She would not dig through the attic and find that old discarded rag doll. She had thrown it up there long ago, and that is where it would stay. She didn't want to see it and remember what it had once been and the value it would have had if only she had taken better care of it. The father, knowing his daughter was through with the doll, went to the attic and gathered her up in his arms. He put her in a bag and took her to an orphanage. He knew that the children there would not have many toys, and certainly none they could call their own. When he arrived, he found a small group of children, boys and girls, who were quietly playing on the dirt floor. They seemed oblivious to their dim surroundings as their laughter floated neatly danced across the floor to where he was. These were the ones. He had picked the right group of kids. He sat down near the children and waited as they all gathered around him. He told them about a special treasure he had hidden in his bag. He told them of its beauty and of its value. All the children sat wide-eyed in anticipation as the father opened the bag and revealed Isabel. From the looks on the children's faces, you would think she had just arrived from the factory, as on that day so long ago. It was as if the children looked past her scraggly hair, her faded smile, her torn side where stuffing was still falling out. It was as if they saw her just as the father had described. For the next hour, each listened carefully as the father began to give each one of them a job on how to care for Isabel. One girl was in charge of combing her hair, and she followed the father's instructions explicitly. Another went to work on carefully washing the dirt and dust stains from the material that made up her body. Two others went about rounding up some old bed sheets and made a little outfit for her. The boys found some cardboard boxes and made her a pair of shoes and a new stand. The older ones worked together to sew up her side and painted on her smile and 2 new rosy cheeks, while the littlest one found her red crown and filling in the hole colored in the missing part of her heart. Working together, this bunch of kids made Isabel look like a treasured doll once again. The father decided he would leave the doll with them. He knew she would be in good hands and that they would care for her, just as he would have loved his own daughter to have done. That was how I felt. I felt like Isabel. Thanks for listening. There's so much more to tell.